Hello, welcome back again. All right, so yes, what if I told you that the entire Bible was fake? You know, obviously that I don't believe in that. But what if I didn't believe in Jesus? What if I didn't have a relationship with Him? But I did believe that there was a God. But the only thing that kept me from having a relationship with Jesus was knowing that the Bible was real, knowing that what was written inside of it was true. You know, so actually that's a lot of people nowadays. I have many friends, good friends, who believe that there is God, but when they read the contents of the Bible, they just find it hard to believe because how could something like that in history actually happen? So really what I wanted to talk about today was just the process and the different requirements that it has taken to make the New Testament that we believe in today, or it's better known as the Canon, what makes it authentic. See, there's a large, complex process to make the authentic canon what it is today, which is actually kind of a good thing. You know, when you tell people it's kind of complicated, usually that's kind of like a cop-out answer. But really, a complicated process is what we want because we base our entire faith off of this. We don't want an easy answer, and we don't want something to just be, oh, let's just take it. We'll pull it in. We'll accept it. So there's a few different ways that they go about, but I want to touch on really just four main points that they use when they determine whether or not the canon is authentic or not. And those are the apostolicity, the apostolicity rule, the rule of faith, the consensus rule, and lastly, the textual criticism rule. So the first one that we're going to look at is, is going to be actually the apostolicity rule. And it's where the document that we find, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, all the following, all the way to Revelations, if it was written by an apostle, which is a person who actually knew Jesus, saw Him, walked with Him, or somebody who actually knew an apostle who was closely related to him. See, Paul would count as an apostle because he had the final experience with Jesus. He saw Jesus face to face. So we would still count him as an apostle. People like Timothy, who walked with Paul, who knew Luke, who knew Mark, we would take that as well into account. So that's the first rule of context. If it wasn't written by an apostle or a person who knew it, they wouldn't accept it. But sometimes that's not even true too, because they talk about in history the lost book of Judas Iscariot, the one who actually betrayed Jesus. They wouldn't take that because it actually holds certain points, viewpoints, that aren't actually authentic. And that's what we call the rule of faith. Even though most documents are written by apostles are accepted, some fail to fall into this rule of faith. And it determines a canonicity of the book based on its alignment with the early Orthodox, which is the doctrine that the church followed. It had to be consistent with a Christian truth. And if it wasn't consistent, it wouldn't make it through. So it has to fall through two filters at this point now. After that, it also calls for the consensus rule. That consensus rule is once we know that it's written by an apostle, once we know that it falls under the right rule of faith, did the early church accept it? Because even though it would fall under the first rule, not all churches would accept that rule because they just couldn't come to an agreement with it. And this was still people who walked with Jesus. This was still the early church that wouldn't agree with some of those things, which would make it hard to actually produce more copies. Which actually brings me to the final rule, and I think this is the most important rule, which is the textual criticism. You see, all three of these other previous points give us the purpose of this faith. It proves to us that we can believe in this. This is good for a Christian to believe in. But the textual criticism rule can actually prove to a non-believer that this document is reliable. See, textual criticism is based on how many copies we have of the New Testament, how many copies we have of each document. Aristotle, we have just a few copies of him. We have, I think it's about, what was it? It was we have about 1,000 copies of Plato and all the different Bibles that the Greeks would use in ancient time. Did you know that just in Greek alone, we have over 5,800 copies of the New Testament? We actually have over 24,000 copies of the New Testament. That's just in Greek, though, that we have that one, which we can most easily discern back to English. We use those to determine what time they were written, and we have those written between 30 years after Christ to a few thousand years after Christ. So we have all this time, and all of them say the exact same thing. Some with minor differences, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all have their minor differences, but the core of the story stays the same. And because of that, we know that it's true. It's written. Hasn't been changed over time. People haven't lied and altered their stories. It all has remained the same. So it makes the Bible, makes the New Testament that much more believable, that much more rich. That story, even though we have so many different translations of the Bible today, it's still the same core message. And if that's, this topic, it's kind of something that we really just don't talk about a whole lot. And I think that's kind of, we're doing ourselves as Christians a bit of a disservice. These are super simple things to remember. We can just remember a few of these key facts about the New Testament. And the reason why I actually chose this speech is because of my friends that think that the Christian faith is just a hoax, that the Bible is just some made-up stories from buried in the dirt a long time ago that we just dug up, and just because that's what happened doesn't make it true then. Well, having this information, understanding the reality of the Bible, that actually makes it more rich to us as believers, but it also makes it much easier to share the gospel message when we know exactly how true it is. So that's something that we can hold on to when we walk away from this. So I appreciate y'all sticking around. Thanks.
Thank y'all. I appreciate it.